Senator Shippy. How are you?
I'm well. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you for coming. Matt. Todd. You can call me idiot.
Matt Todd.
The idiot's the best. I always answer to that. So
it's 2 first names.
Yeah, well, I mean 3 if you count my middle name as well. So,
okay.
It's a good time. Thank you for coming in. I know it's earlier in the day, but I appreciate you making the time. Listen, just speaking beforehand, there are so many things that I think are really interesting about your perspectives on the proper role of government. You actually your family has a rich history with I don't want to make it like dramatic conflict with government, but involved in some turmoil around homeschooling. And then again, that leads to what is the proper role of government, right? Like who's determining educational efficacy? Who's determining educational propriety? Is the role of government to, remove family members from each other if, okay, I'm not teaching the right math, or I'm not teaching math at all. It's like, okay, say I have kids and I'm not teaching geometry. Is the proper role of government to remove my children from me? Because they're like, sine, cosine, tangent, like we need area, circle, pi r squared, like let's go. So talk to me about this, because again, when we talk about the chicken bill, right? When we talk about the freedom of speech bill that kind of came up recently, that was trying to enhance prosecution for libel to become a felony against political people. Like all of these things what is the proper role of government in today's contemporary political world?
I think that's probably the main issue to deal with right now in the legislature, as bills are coming through, and not that I always get it right on every bill, but that's the main issue in my opinion, is what is the proper role of government? It's not whether or not you're going to spend the money here or going to spend the money there. It's whether or not it's the proper role of government to even do that in the first place. So there are some politicians who would say, some legislators that would say that any spending is bad, any raising in taxes is bad, sure. Any higher appropriations is bad inherently. I disagree with that. If it's the proper place of government to do that, then it's appropriate to spend a little more in that area. One of the proper roles of government is really simple. It's to create a flourishing society, but through law and order. So we need a judicial system. We need a police force to make sure that the laws are being followed. Without proper rule of law, you have anarchy and you have tyranny just running rampant. You don't have freedom without law. So you have to have law. You have to have a proper judicial system, which that takes money. And so if you had a city that had rampant crime, you might need to bolster up your police force. You might need to hire on more police officers, get better equipment, better training. That's going to cost money. That's going to raise taxes, but that's a proper role of government. But increasing, let's say, the welfare state, raising food stamps. I don't think they're called food stamps anymore, but raising the level from
government supplied nutrition.
Right. So raising it from 100% of the federal poverty level to 500%. That would be an improper role of government to just continue to subsidize somebody that maybe it doesn't want to work hard enough to provide for their own sustenance, or they just like to wastefully spend on things that aren't necessary, and so they need government handouts. Those are not proper places of government. I think there is a limited role that government should play. I would argue as locally as possible when it comes to caring for the poor, for those who are truly needy in society. I think most of these things should be left to churches and nonprofit organizations. But I think there is a limited role, a limited obligation to localized government to make sure that the poor among them are being taken care of. Now, there are I think there are work requirements, other things that are really prudent to include within that support. But going back, and I want to circle back around to the chicken bill at some point.
Can I ask you a question? Are you familiar with any of the attempts at universal basic income where they were giving individuals? I remember reading one study, I think it was from Stockton, where they had given people some amount of money with no questions asked for a certain period of time. They're like, this is going to be great. Like these people are going to invest in their future and they're going to, make, and they of course would showcase like one person who did say actually like, okay, here's the thing. I was trying to get this better job and like this money actually helped me get a better job in some way. I was either able to take off more time for like interviews or like upgrade my attire or whatever. And there was some degree of like, yeah, I actually improved my life using this, infusion of investment. Okay, great. Because that person had security so they could take a chance. Right. But other people didn't. Right. It was like, the money was not spent super effectively or, in a way that would justify that style of behavior. So again, to your point of like, well, is the proper role of government to increase for, up to 500%. Is a proper role of government to take swings on certain people. Like there are all of these problems where I think we look at I think the answer is always yes and no. There are likely some people who would benefit from an increase in food assistance, right? But there are other people that wouldn't. Just like there are some people that, like, if you gave them $500, they'd invest in their future and they'd do a better job with, whatever and then there are some people that just spend money. So it's one of those things where we're like, okay, if we don't know that this is going to work for sure, it's probably not a great idea to do, right? Because we're going to have diminishing returns as we go farther and farther away from like the absolute base.
Yeah. So my saying my grandpa always had was that the ones who would take, if you were going to give somebody some money, the ones who were going to use it properly and to make good use of it are the people that don't need it. And
they already have
money. And the people that are going to squander it and waste it are the people, the people that need it are the ones who are going to just squander it and waste it. That was his opinion. He was a generous man.
Sure.
But there are several things wrapped up in this. It's really easy for me to be generous with your money, by the way. So when a legislature spends money, he's not spending his own money. He's spending the taxpayers' money, because government doesn't have any money. Government doesn't produce. Government, as an old French proverb says, that government is a watchdog to be fed, not a cow to be milked. And so this idea that
you're good with the sayings here.
We see government as just one that provides handouts and the proper role. It's a watchdog. It's meant to bear the sword. It's to punish evil and reward good. Government has its proper role in upholding law and order in society, but not being the cow that's milked. So when it comes to the proper place of this universal income or whatever it might be, if we look at human nature, there's a tendency in our own human nature to be lazy, and we're driven by reward. And there was a professor, I don't know whether or not the story is true or not, you've probably heard it before, but there was a professor that was arguing with his class. They were arguing for socialism, he was arguing for capitalism. And he said, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to do an experiment. There 15 class members, or whatever it might be. And he says, what we're going to do is all your grades are going to be piled into one box. Whatever they are, they're going to be put into one large grade. And then I'm going to divide it up evenly at the end of the semester between the 15 of you. And what happened was they all failed in the end. Why? Because the ones who were going to get high grades, they were working hard. They became discouraged because the ones who were going to get lower grades said, hey, we're just going to have a free ride in, so I don't even have to work hard at all. So it even discouraged them to work at all. When the others saw that, it discouraged them to work because they weren't getting the true reward of their labor. And at the end of the day, they all quit. And so if there's no reward at the end of the race, why would anyone run hard? And that's human nature. If everyone gets an equal outcome, an equal trophy for the race, why would anybody even strive to train and win? And so we are driven by reward. And so at the end of the day, if you just hand out free money with no strings attached, it's going to drive down productivity. It's going to drive down incentive to work hard. It's going to take away all motivation, especially men. Men are motivated to strive and to seek reward and to accomplish. There's my grandpa would always say, there's peace in working. There's something about accomplishing. But if everyone just gets equal outcome, regardless of input, it does discourage and it brings everyone down. It lowers all of society. It lowers productivity. When there's less goods and services to go around, it doesn't matter how much cash is in your pocket, you're not going to be able to purchase what you want. So at the end of the day, universal income, knowing history, knowing human nature, it will always fail. It will always fail.
I don't know if the desire to strive and effort is really like uniquely a male thing. Do you? Like my wife was a D1 water polo captain, and all through her time in college. Like she plays on a co-ed water polo team now. They just went down to Ogden, Utah, and won a water polo tournament like 2 weeks ago. It's like here's my wife and a bunch of like 250-pound dudes, and they go down and like light it up. They go like 6 games deep. It was pretty wild. I think they beat BYU or something. Like they beat college teams and stuff. It's like, here are these older Masters teams. Anyway,
Yeah, I would say it's definitely not uniquely male.
Yeah,
but it is I don't know if I could even say it's predominantly male, but men are definitely driven by accomplishment and by, even just the praise of others for their accomplishments, I think in a unique way. And
we are definitely different creatures.
Yes.
And I think
when you hand over free stuff is what I'm saying, is that it takes away all that incentive, all that drive to produce and to make something of yourself if you're just giving it for free.
Well, this is, and I don't mean to turn the conversation dark, but this is a very, very well understood problem worldwide with essentially like a young adult men or even middle-aged adult men that like are living in their mom's basement watching porn and playing video games, right? Like if given enough stimulus, right, where it's like you don't have to strive to like get a relationship with a gal and you don't have to become the person worthy of a relationship with a gal, you just have to log into this computer and you can have like a Diet Coke of a relationship, which is like, it feels kind of like a relationship for a little while, but it'll never get you through. And in the absence of, like they have that, and it takes just enough drive away that they become these like failure to launch individuals. This is a distinctly male problem, right? Like you don't see a lot of young women or young adult women that are like living in their mom's basement, playing video games and pretending like they have relationships with people online, right? Like that's not, I'm sure there's some portion of them, but it's again, a very male thing. There's actually there's a hormone that's produced for young men that I was listening to a physician talk about this months back, but there's a hormone that's produced for young men that makes them happier when they're efforting, whatever that effort may be. Like as a 12-year-old, I don't remember I was not particularly like tough or hard or anything, but I remember joining the wrestling team when I was 14, and that was one of the first times in my life where this desire, this like grit to sink my teeth into something happened. And I remember that sensation very clearly. And as I've gotten older, and then I, went on to be an athlete in college as well, a bunch of other things, I remember that feeling so well. And now as, in my 40s, I'm like, okay, this makes sense. Like, yeah, I'm willful now, but I don't get the same pleasure out of just beating the living hell out of myself that I did when I was 20. So like there is a place in the world biologically for men to have purpose and effort that gives a positive reinforcement. Did you ever read Bentham and Mills, Social Scientists on Utilitarianism?
I haven't.
It's very much what you're talking about, which is maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain. Right. Yeah. Like we need the incentivization structure to veer away from the thing that hurts and veer towards the thing that we like. And outside of that paradigm, there is no course of action, right? Like, why are you going to act in a certain way? It always comes down to, because I think I'm going to either maximize my pleasure or I think I'm going to get away from pain. Every single decision boils down to that.
Yeah, and whether or not there's a massive conspiracy to do this, what you were mentioning, or it's just happenstance.
Yeah, right.
What has happened, and a population that is passive, especially a male population that is passive, that has been doled into being passive through pornography, through video games, through handouts with no strings attached. Whatever it might be, keep them in their parents' basement. They are much easier to control. They are less of a threat to society, you might would say. Is not in some negative way, but just in some way where they are productive, where they are stepping out and making a real difference in their communities. If they're staying in their basements and they're addicted to pornography and video games, they're completely useless. And at the end of the day, they're depressed. They're unhappy. They're not actually being fulfilled. Yeah.
Okay,
that was a rabbit trail.
Yeah, let's get back to the chicken bill. I don't know. That's great. So again, proper role of government with the chicken bill. You voted against it. Now you don't hate chickens. Like this is not but you didn't think that this was the appropriate thing to vote for. Talk to me about this.
Yeah, absolutely. So I live in the county. We have 30 chickens. We're actually supposed to be getting about 30 more chicks I think today or tomorrow. Actually, my wife's going to pick them up.
Do you eat them and when they're at the end?
These are actually going to be layers, so they will be producing eggs. So
what do you do when they don't lay eggs anymore, though?
They get cooked into broth.
Yes, you do.
Chicken broth is the best.
I love the propensity that's so different. It's a different culture where I came from, but the premise is like, no, I have pets, and then I eat them.
Yeah, they're not pets. We have a dog. We don't eat the dog. So I'm not against chickens.
Okay.
This is about the proper role of the state. So what the chicken bill did was that it inserts itself into private contracts or decisions that have been previously made. Now, we'll see if it even holds up. But what this does is it says that any HOAs that had previously said you couldn't have chickens are forced now by the power of the state to allow up to 4 chickens for 2/10 of an acre, 4 hens, let's say, because it doesn't force them to also allow a rooster.
Right, which could be a social disturbance.
Right. But at the end of the day, how this bill was being painted was that it was restoring the right to produce your own food. That was the idea that's the premise under which this bill was presented. The problem is it doesn't do that. It doesn't do that because to exclude a rooster, that's arbitrary, because it's not about whether or not it's a nuisance. It's about whether or not you can produce your own food. And I could argue that fertile eggs are actually healthier than non-fertile eggs. So why not the rooster? I actually would prefer to have a rooster with my hens. But if it's about food security, why not allow a hog? Just because they're smelly doesn't take away my right to produce my own food.
They're no smellier than dogs.
If it's about
if you bathe the hog, it's literally like a dog.
But if it's about food security, if it's about my right to food security, then you can't restrict it to chickens. You'd have to allow goats and whatever else might be. Sheep, goats are a nuisance, but at the end of the day, it has nothing to do with being a nuisance. Yeah. And so what it is there are people that live in subdivisions that would like chickens. So what they're willing to do is use the power of the state to nullify previously private held agreements. So somebody purchase a house in an HOA, they have good faith to believe that's going to be upheld. They don't want a chicken for a neighbor. And yet the state steps in and says, actually, we're going to force you to allow for chickens to be your neighbors. And it's an arbitrary use of state power. And I believe it's a violation of private property rights, because what it does is it inserts itself into private decisions that were made without any state input. It's between 2 private parties or more. And so the state is inserting itself into that and violating that.
Okay, but if I may, and again, I totally get what you're saying, like 1,000%. First off, we know the game of politics is a game of compromise. So if I want food security, but somebody's like, hey, I have a real problem with this, it's like, okay, articulate your problems with this. They're like, I don't want the noise. It's like, okay, we'll take away the noise. We've made a compromise. My idea was still fundamentally on food security. But be that as it may, what do you think about the state inserting itself with like solar panels? So HOAs can't restrict solar panels or like political flags or things of that nature.
It's the same thing.
Same thing.
It's the same thing.
Forget the solar panels. Get out of here with your panel.
It's the same thing. And what it is that setting a precedence that the state can step in at any moment and insert itself into a private contract or decision. Maybe what if they did that with marriage? What if they did that with other things? They would say, you know what, we think this is unhealthy for your neighborhood for you two to be married. We're going to separate you. That was a private agreement between 2 parties. What right do you have to insert yourself? So these are localized issues. It's not like a city or a county that is violating people's rights, and the state needs to step in and say, "Hey, we're not going to allow you to force people to wear masks." Let's say. I believe that was a personal rights issue that political subdivisions of the state were violating personal rights and liberties.
Hence the statewide agreement.
That's exactly. So I voted for that, but it's different than a private agreement here. So what I would say is, if you would like chickens in your neighborhood, then you need to lobby your HOA. You need to try to get this changed so that you can have chickens in your neighborhood, rather than saying, hey, the easier route is just to lobby my legislators and then use arbitrary state power to force it. But the state doesn't have all power. It's limited to what the Constitution, which is the face of the people, gives them the directive to do. So I would argue that the state doesn't just have all power. It's limited to that scope of what the Constitution directs them to do, not just what it explicitly forbids them to do, but it's also limited to what it directs them to do. If you follow what I'm saying there.
Listen, I'm tracking 100%. Then let me ask you something. How do we reconcile, and pivoting, understood on the chickens, got it. How do we reconcile larger societal problems where we end up needing to take care of people? Okay, for instance, you're on health and welfare. Okay, we have the Medicaid expansion. There were several bills to repeal, reform, and now, we landed on one that's like, all right, look, seems that most people are happy with this. I'm sure there's somebody who's unhappy, but most people are happy with it. part inherent in the Medicaid expansion conversation is like, okay, why can't we just repeal this? And it's like, well, there will be people in our society that we will end up taking care of, and we will be in a worse position financially and from a health standpoint. There will be people that do not have health insurance. They either don't engage in it or they don't have enough money for it. They get in catastrophic car accidents. The indigent population, I can never say that word right. Did I get that right? Indigent? I think it's right.
I'm not sure.
Okay. You and me, buddy.
I'm a country boy.
Oh my God. It's like a $10 word. Anyway, there's that population, which is, again, people that just will not or cannot take care of themselves. And I very much believe in self-reliance and determination, not put to an extreme, to an extreme level, but how do we iron this one out? Which is like, look, there will be some people we have to take care of no matter what.
Yeah. So several boxes here. One is the question of what is the proper role and responsibility of the state. Two, the problems with socialism is that it creates generational problems that can't be undone except generationally. So you cannot undo the ills of socialism overnight. So it's a generational problem.
Could you give me an example of that? So,
for example, one would be entitlements such as maybe it's a Meals on Wheels or something for the elderly.
Okay.
So whose proper role is it to provide food for the elderly? Is it the state, or is it local communities? Is it local charities, churches, so forth? Family, of course, it starts at family, I would argue, and then also churches. That's where it should be. So why is the state doing this? Well, because the state started doing this generations ago. And now we've created a mindset that the state has an obligation. I had a conversation with somebody the other day, and there was some program, I don't recall which one it was, that was going to maybe go away through health and welfare, and they were panicked. And he said that their church had offered to step in and fill the gap. But he said, no way would he allow that, because the state has the obligation to do that. And I felt the need to have a conversation about that his church actually is that them stepping up is the proper way, the proper order of things. It actually isn't the state's first obligation to take care of the poor or the needy. They may fill in the gap, but what we've done as a deacon at my church, we've talked about this a lot, is that the state has overwhelmingly replaced the church and its proper role in society, which is to care for the poor, especially their own poor, and then poor outside of them as well. But we've punted all that to the state generations ago. And so now we have a mindset that it is the state's obligation. So many people depend on that. There was a Meals on Wheels, which brings hot meals, and there was another, and they were short. So there was another program being, that was filling the gap. And I don't remember which program it was, but they were freezer meals, essentially. They were inferior in quality. And so what happened was there was a testimony of the need for these Meals on Wheels, that we need hot meals for these senior citizens. They had brought this freezer meal to them, or it was whatever, peel the tab or whatever, and they threw it across the room and said, "This is garbage." And in my mind, it reminded me of the sense of entitlement, that I'm entitled. It's free food, but I'm entitled to a hot meal instead of a one that's been it's in a freezer meal or something. And it's a mindset shift. And so socialism cannot be shut off overnight, because people will starve to death. People are dependent on government support. And so you have to fix it generationally. It's been created generationally. You have to fix it generationally. And this was my big beef with the school choice bill, was that it is taking an independent, self-reliant people, and it's creating government dependence where there was previously self-responsibility. So this was a big problem that I had, because the process of entitlement is that the first generation appreciates it, the second generation expects it, the third generation demands it. So you have to roll it back in the same order. It's going to take generations to turn it back to where it's supposed to be, where the government is fulfilling its proper role in society, instead of just being the cow that's milked. It's being the watchdog that's being fed, and it's filling its proper role, which is meant to be limited and small, and not the all-powerful, almighty government that everyone looks to for everything.
For the solutions, yeah. Your point on the homeschooling, the school choice, I have heard that from a lot of people saying, hey, look, first off, when you start giving government money to private schools, you eliminate private schools. They're now a function of the government, right? And as some people have articulated, hey, they're what we will likely see if the average tuition for private school is $10,000 right now, before school choice, once school choice passes, it will increase, let's say 25% to $12,500. And at that point, it's likely that the services included in that private school, the offerings of that private school will increase, at least in some part, with the increase in tuition because of the access to money. And then all of a sudden, if say 10 years down the road or 20 years down the road, they're like, hey, let's take away this $5,000 payment to parents for these schools. The schools will all of a sudden say, hey, you can't take that away, because if you take that away, then the parents won't be able to afford my school. It's like,
now,
well,
it's
but
now
now
entitlement.
Yeah, now it's part of the business model has become, we better keep this $5,000 coming, or else we can't actually function this way anymore.
Right. The first year you have extra money. The second year it's built into the budget. And then it's expected from there on. That's how it will work. The prices rise so that the people that could afford it before will be the only people that can afford it now, because everybody, as a business owner, I want to pay my guys more. There's always pressure to raise wages, to update equipment, and how you alleviate that pressure is being able to charge more for your services. And so as soon as the market will support a higher price, I will raise my prices. And so the private schools are doing the same thing. As soon as the market will support a higher price, they'll raise the price. So if you think about the average homeschool family is spending about $1,500 a child, and now they have available, they can spend up to $5,000. So what motivation do they have to spend less than that now? And so the market will, whatever you're purchasing in the market that previously was driven by the cost factor is no longer going to be controlled by cost factors. So what is the pressures of cost produce in the market? Efficiency, entrepreneurship,
innovation.
Yeah. It does all these things. What happens when you take away the cost factor, because now there's 3 times available what was available before. You're going to remove all those pressures, and so you're going to get inefficiency. You're going to get bloat. You're going to get all these problems. No one's going to market based upon how cheap they're selling their products for, because they've been able to make them efficiently. Why? Because everybody can afford up to $5,000. So that whole portion of the market is driven away, and now it's by whether it's different ways that they're going to market it, whether it's flashier ads or it's going to, something else is going to drive the market, and ultimately you have one customer who pays the bill, and it's the state. And so you ultimately do get, over time you will get, it's universal education is what the goal is, but you just have a big universal public school, and that's it, with different aspects of it. And maybe that's a positive thing in some ways, but I argue it's going to be more of a negative thing than it will be positive. And I think generationally it will be negative.
Well, ultimately, for sure, it's going to end up costing Idaho more money.
Absolutely.
Right? Like that's what it seems. And to your point, I think we don't have to look any farther than the problems with cost of higher education, right? Because those higher education was going up in cost, fine, but we also made student debt the safest debt the world has ever known. Like in the functional first world, where it's kind of like, okay, you can bankrupt out of pretty much anything. It's like, no, but I got you for that bachelor's degree. Like, you're gonna die with this debt, and that's this huge problem, because then as the student debt was something you could never get rid of, banks realize, like, okay, we own this person until they pay us back. Well, let's give them more money. Like, people, like, we're going to have to repo that Camaro, and, like, it's probably going to be banged up. It's not going to be worth that much. We won't get all our money back, or we'll, foreclose on the house, and it was worth this much, and now we're going to take a haircut. We're not taking a haircut.
Debt is modern slavery.
I have heard that. I don't know that I entirely agree.
It's limited. It's limited, but there is a sense where you are owned.
Well, I think this goes down to a larger question about what is ownership and what is obligation, and what is voluntarily engaged in obligation. That's a difference than, like, I was born into slavery.
Yeah. I'm using the term loosely.
I'm aware.
But when you have no debt, you have more freedom.
Well, that depends, right? When you have no debt, do you have freedom to engage? Do you have freedom, for instance, let's look at real estate. When you have no debt and you don't own property, do you have the freedom to charge rent in exchange for property? No. Right. And very frequently you have to engage in tolerable debt. You take a risk, then you get the rights to charge for property. So like, it's like, I get what you're saying.
I borrow money for good purposes.
Yeah. Listen, what is it? David Ramsey's big on that too. Right. Which, so is Mark Cuban. He's like, pay off all your debt. Like I have no consumer debt. Like I don't have a car loan. I don't have a credit card. I do have a house, right? I'm not like balling out of my mind. It's like own my house outright. Even that though, I'd be paying property tax and likely I'd be engaging in some kind of insurance mechanism. Yeah. But yeah, look, I get everything you're saying, but what do we do now? Right? Like this is the place, this is where we are as a state, right? Like how do we, and is there, for instance, let's look at our law enforcement, like, or our fire districts. Do we really want to privatize our fire districts? Do we really want to privatize law enforcement or our jail system, right? Because the private sector has been known time and time again to be incentivized financially, which they should be, like every private sector thing, engagement should be a financial incentive. And then once you get incentivized financially to house more criminals or have more people in a jail system, because that's how you make money. If that's the business model, that becomes a real problem, right? So like, is there a place for socialized services in an appropriately planned out government?
No, absolutely.
Wait, you said no and then absolutely.
No, absolutely. Folks of my age start with "I mean" a lot too.
What do you mean your age? We're like the same age, bro. Like I'm not that old. By the way, what's your business? You said you're in your business when you hire people. What do you do?
I'm a sprinkler contractor.
Look at you, dude. I fixed my sprinkler last year. I had this dead spot in my grass, and I was furious. I was like, "What the hell is going on?" You know what happened? The person who installed the sprinkler just pushed it literally like a quarter inch too far down, so the sprinkler head would pop up and then all the way down to the. So then I was like, "I have sprinklers here," so I had to dig it up. I had to dig out behind it, and then I had to shove a bunch of rocks and like tilt it back. I fixed it all. Look at that. Yeah. I'm half Mexican though, so like you knew that was coming. Anyway, yeah. So you hire more people. Are you a big sprinkler blowout guy too? Like in the fall?
We do a lot of sprinkler winterizations.
Dude, yes, that's the gangster play.
Yeah,
you got to bring me on next year. I'm great. I'm a great people person. I love doing sprinkler blowouts.
It's cutthroat. It's cutthroat though, man. You get somebody that are like, hey, they're only charging $25 in Caldwell, and you're like, well, get somebody from Caldwell then.
Right.
It costs you $30 just to do it, and it's got very little margin. It's not. I do it as a warm fuzzy for my clients. But it's not something that you're going to make a lot of
big
profit.
Listen, I bought a pancake compressor, like a 6-gallon pancake compressor last year, and I did my sprinkler blowouts. But of course, as you know, the problem with sprinkler blowouts is you got to let them run for like a minute and a half, 2 minutes, right? Well, the pancake compressor only had 20 seconds in it, so I literally had it with like open the valve, 20 seconds go by, turn off the valve, and then I'd have to sit here waiting for like 5 minutes until it filled back up, and then it took me hours.
Yeah, it's not worth it. It's not worth it.
I'll tell you what, it's not worth it now.
Pay the guy $50 and. So going back to your question. Back to your question, I can't think of a conceivable way that you could have a police force, a judicial system, any of that privatized. Sure. That has to be part of the function of government. And I also believe that EMS, fire as well, is going to be best in the public sphere.
Right.
I've not heard an argument that has convinced me that those services even are going to be best to be privatized. Just because of the nature their nature, whether it's a rescue, these are public services that are obligated to everyone,
right? And
so then everyone is obligated to them. So that just doesn't play the same role in society as private organizations or private business and so forth.
Yeah. Okay. That makes perfect sense to me. And again, I haven't heard them either. I've always wondered because people use that term of like, socialism. It's like, okay, I understand. Like, I'm no fan of what has happened in Venezuela. And like, I've actually never had a job. I have been self-employed my entire life. Like I have always had to try to find something valuable that I can offer somebody and they would engage in voluntarily to just pay any bill I've ever had. But my point is that I also see, as we're talking about the proper role of government, that like, okay, well, yeah, to a point. right? Because I don't want the fire department to roll up to a burning house next to my house and be like, I ain't putting that out. He didn't pay a bill.
Right.
And then it's like, it puts everybody at risk. It's terrible. Like people could die in there.
Yeah. And they have an obligation to that. And that like I said, it goes both ways. If the department has an obligation to the public, then the public has an obligation to the department. And then it goes both ways. When it comes to the proper role of government, I think it's worth talking about. The basic proper role of government is protecting individual rights.
Bro, which you're kicking my leg, my guy. He thought it was a tape. I'm like, he's kicking me. I'm sorry.
Sorry about that.
You're good. There's a center bar.
My feet are too long.
No, I know. There's a center bar on the table. I do it too. So because sometimes I'm pushing my foot to the. It's all right. Keep going.
Yeah. So when you talk about an essential right, so it's the right of property, the right to your own labor.
Sure.
So the right to inalienable rights such as the right to life, which is the most basic. Sure. The right to freedom of speech. When we think about the proper role of government is to protect those rights. Right. Obviously, not to infringe upon those rights themselves as the government, but also to protect those rights from each other. So me not infringing upon your rights and so forth. But then we have to understand, we hear people talk about something being a right, but I think we have to differentiate between a right and goods and services. And this is something I think gets lost in the conversation a lot, is that when you understand what is the difference. Let me ask you if you don't mind. I know, let me drive the truck a little bit here.
Listen, but remember, idiot.
What is the difference between a right or goods and services?
I mean, a right is something that is.
You just started with I mean, but go on.
I did. I mean, look. I would say a right is something that is very narrowly defined as an obligation to protect by the government, right? So the government has an obligation to protect life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I have those inalienable rights. And then we had Bill of Rights and constitutional amendments that defined, okay, look, these are the guardrails, right? This is a very narrow scope of thing that the government is supposed to engage in protecting, preserving, things of that nature, right? And we all agree to that. Right, we assemble and we have formed this government and we agree with the terms of the government, and we can obviously leave if we don't like it, and that's it. And a good and a service is not that.
Yes. So you have the right to defend yourself with a firearm. Okay. With a firearm. So if you have the right to defend yourself with a firearm, do you have a right to a gun? Meaning that does government have the obligation to provide you a gun? And the answer is no, because you have the right to defend yourself, but you have to go buy your own gun. A gun requires goods and services. If I have a right to a cell phone, we hear people say that, hey, I have a right to a cell phone, or maybe they say I have a right to healthcare. People call something a right, but does it require the labor of someone else? Is what you're saying you have a right to, does it require the labor of someone else?
Well, in the case of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, at times it does, because it requires a legal and criminal system to preserve these things.
Now, if you've paid for it, such as through your taxes, the judicial system,
or if I haven't paid for it,
perhaps
I could be a homeless person. Right.
Sure.
I still have these inalienable rights.
Sure. When I pay for something, then I have the right to what I've paid for, but I don't inherently have a right to your labor.
Sure.
For me to claim that I have a right to your labor, your goods and services that you're offering for free, that's to claim a right over your labor is to claim ownership of you, because you alone own the right to your labor, and you need to be compensated for that. And so often, what I'm kind of getting down to is that people will point to something and say that I have a right to that. Well, if you've paid for it, then you have a right to that, but you don't inherently have a right to someone else's labor or the goods they're offering and so forth. So understanding that, I think, is really crucial to what is an inalienable right versus an entitlement, a privilege, or something that you've actually purchased and you then have a right to. So I think that conversation is important to understand when it comes to the proper role of government in society, because Gotcha. I think we can get caught up into calling entitlements a right when it maybe isn't actually a right. Maybe somebody hasn't labored and yet do they have a right to food? Well, they haven't produced any labor and contributed anything. Do they have a right to my labor because they exist? And the answer is no, not automatically. If they paid for my labor, then they have a right to it, right? So I think that's an important topic. It gets pretty deep here.
Listen to me. Senator Shippy, we did not allot multiple hours for this interview. You came here. I think you got like an 8:45. Listen, I really please come back. Let's continue. I feel like we're barely touched on a couple different topics here. I really appreciate this. Is there anything you want to say here at the end?
Not particularly. Okay. I just appreciate the opportunity here, and this has been
a
fun conversation. It really has been. We've kind of touched on a lot of things, but not really wrapped anything up with a bow.
Yeah. Well, listen, it's really hard to, and just coming into the conversation with like, oh, we're like we talked about like a couple things just briefly before we started. All came back to the proper role of government. It's like this is going to be lit. Here we go. So look, let's keep the conversation going. I know today's a busy day. Thank you for coming in, and we'll do it again.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me on.